The airport was bustling with life. Passengers rolling their suitcases, announcements echoing through the terminals, and the scent of fresh coffee drifting from nearby kiosks. Among the crowd, a woman stood quietly, her presence unassuming. She wasn't dressed in luxury, nor did she carry an expensive handbag. In fact, she looked like any other passenger waiting to board a flight. Her name was Sarah, a woman who had always believed in simplicity despite being married to one of the richest men in the world. Today, she had chosen to travel alone, booking a ticket under her maiden name, wanting nothing more than to enjoy a peaceful journey without the weight of her husband's status following her. Sarah's husband, Daniel Crawford, owned one of the most prestigious airlines in the world, Crawford Airways. His name was a symbol of power and wealth, and every time she traveled under his identity, the treatment she received was far from normal. The moment airline staff saw her name, they would scramble to please her, offering upgrades, VIP lounges, and unnecessary attention. Sarah had grown tired of it. She wanted to be treated like everyone else for once. So, she had booked an economy-class ticket, just another passenger among the hundreds flying that day. As she handed over her boarding pass at the check-in counter, the airline staff barely glanced at her. No warm smiles, no extra pleasantries, just the standard formalities. It was exactly what she had wanted. Sarah sighed in relief, glad that no one recognized her. But as she walked toward security, a small part of her couldn't ignore a strange feeling. She had always been treated with respect, even before marrying Daniel. But today something felt off. The check-in agent had barely acknowledged her, and now, as she approached the boarding gate, the crew seemed different. A young flight attendant, Emma, whispered something to her colleague while pointing discreetly in Sarah's direction. Sarah noticed it but chose to ignore it. She had seen flight attendants gossip before. It was normal. Yet, as she moved forward, she caught a glimpse of their expressions. Not friendly. Not neutral. Something else entirely. When it was finally time to board, Sarah walked down the jet bridge, entering the aircraft. The crew at the entrance barely greeted her. No smiles, no warm welcome, just a dull nod. Again she brushed it off. After all, she had chosen to be just another passenger. Maybe she was overthinking it. She found her seat, placed her small handbag in front of her, and tried to get comfortable. As the flight attendants moved around, preparing for takeoff, Sarah couldn't help but notice something strange. The same young attendant from before, Emma, kept stealing glances at her. Then another crew member, a senior flight attendant named Mark, leaned in and whispered something to Emma. The two of them exchanged looks, their expressions unreadable. Minutes later, Emma walked toward Sarah's row, stopping right beside her seat. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to move," she said flatly. Sarah blinked in confusion. "Move? But this is my assigned seat." Emma's lips curled into a tight, forced smile. "Yes, but we have a seating adjustment to make. You'll need to switch." Sarah frowned. "But why? This is my ticketed seat." Mark appeared beside Emma, his expression firmer. "It's just a routine adjustment. Please cooperate." Something about the way they spoke didn't sit right with Sarah. It wasn't a polite request. It was an order. She glanced around. Other passengers were watching now, sensing the tension. Feeling a knot form in her stomach, she took a deep breath and stood up. "Fine. Where do you want me to sit?" Emma turned and pointed toward the back of the plane, right near the restrooms in a cramped, uncomfortable row. Sarah's heart sank. This wasn't just about moving her seat. This was something else. As she picked up her bag and made her way toward the back, whispers spread through the cabin. She caught snippets of murmurs from nearby passengers. Did she do something? Why are they moving her? Must be trouble. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Embarrassment. Humiliation. But more than that, confusion. Why was this happening? And then, just before she sat down, she overheard a conversation between Emma and Mark that sent a chill down her spine. "She's probably trying to scam a free upgrade," Emma muttered under her breath. "People like her always do." Mark chuckled. Well, she's not getting away with it on our flight. Sarah froze. Her fingers tightened around the armrest. They thought she was a fraud. They had no idea who she really was. And they had just made a huge mistake. Sarah sat down in the cramped seat at the back of the plane, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. She had always tried to live a quiet life, far from the spotlight that her husband's wealth cast over them. She had never sought attention, never wanted the extra perks that came with being married to one of the richest men in the world. She simply wanted to be treated like everyone else. But today everything felt wrong. As she settled in, trying to shake off the unease, she glanced around at the passengers in her new section. They were all either reading, chatting quietly, or minding their own business. But every now and then, Sarah could feel their eyes on her. She was used to being watched. She had been Daniel's wife for years after all, but this felt different. It wasn't the usual admiration or curiosity. It was more like suspicion. The flight attendants continued their preparations for takeoff, but Sarah couldn't help but notice how the crew's demeanor had shifted since she'd been moved. They seemed to be walking with purpose now, glancing at her every so often, their eyes narrow and calculating. It made her skin crawl. It wasn't just the crew that had changed. She too felt different. As if the woman who had sat in first class only minutes ago had been replaced by someone else. Someone disposable. Someone who didn't matter. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Sarah's thoughts drifted back to her life with Daniel. She had met him years ago when she was still just starting her career. He had been charming, successful, and charismatic. At first, she had been swept off her feet by his attention and the life he offered. They married within a year, and Sarah quickly found herself living in a world of luxury. Private jets, exclusive parties, and more designer clothes than she could ever wear. But as time passed, she began to feel suffocated. She missed the simple things, spending time in the kitchen making a home-cooked meal, enjoying a walk through the park without being hounded by the press, or just having a conversation with someone who didn't see her as a trophy wife. It was the small moments, the simple joys, that she missed the most. So, when she had booked this flight, she hadn't told Daniel. She hadn't told anyone. She just needed a break, a moment of peace. She had hoped the airline would be her chance to escape the whirlwind of wealth and constant attention that defined her world. But now, as she sat in the back of the plane, it seemed like she was being punished for it. The flight continued, and Sarah tried to distract herself by scrolling through her phone. She wasn't checking messages. She had purposely turned off notifications for the day, but rather she was looking for something to ease her mind. Her fingers hovered over an email from Daniel, but she quickly closed it. She couldn't deal with it right now. Instead, she found herself glancing back toward the front of the plane. She couldn't see the entire cabin from where she sat, but she could make out the faint silhouettes of the crew as they moved around. Emma was near the front, speaking to the captain, her voice too low for Sarah to catch. Mark was talking to another crew member, his face hard and serious. Suddenly, there was a sharp crackling sound from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice announced, "we'll be cruising at an altitude of 30,000 feet in just a few minutes. Please sit back and enjoy the flight." Sarah glanced at her seatbelt, ensuring it was fastened. She tried to relax, but the tension in her chest wouldn't let up. She felt the weight of the crew's eyes on her, like they were waiting for her to do something wrong. A few minutes later, the plane reached cruising altitude, and the seatbelt signs flickered off. Passengers began to move around, stretching their legs or heading to the restroom. Sarah stayed in her seat, keeping to herself, her mind still swirling with questions. Why had they moved her? Why had Emma and Mark acted like they knew something she didn't? Her thoughts were interrupted when Emma appeared beside her again, this time with a tray of drinks. "Can I get you something?" she asked, her voice tight but polite. Sarah studied her for a moment, her eyes narrowing. She had a feeling Emma wasn't offering her a drink out of genuine kindness. She had an agenda. "No, thank you," Sarah said, her voice cool. Emma hesitated for a moment, as if she was about to say something else, but then simply nodded and moved on. Sarah watched her leave, her suspicion growing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The rest of the flight passed in a blur. Sarah tried to ignore the stares and whispers, but it was hard to focus on anything else. Her mind kept returning to what she had overheard earlier, the comments from the crew, trying to scam a free upgrade. Sarah's heart sank as she thought about the possibility. Could they really think she was trying to cheat her way into a better seat? Did they think she was pretending to be someone she wasn't? Her thoughts spiraled. What if the crew figured out who she really was? What if they had already recognized her, but were too embarrassed to admit their mistake? Would they apologize, or would they just double down on their assumptions? The tension in the cabin was palpable. Passengers were whispering to one another, casting furtive glances at Sarah. She couldn't escape the feeling that the crew was deliberately avoiding her, as if they were trying to make her feel uncomfortable. But why? As the flight continued, Sarah's unease grew. The crew's behavior had become more erratic. They were moving around in a hurry, almost as if they were trying to hide something. She watched as Mark and Emma exchanged another look, and then the two of them disappeared into the galley. That's when Sarah saw something that made her blood run cold. A man in a suit was walking down the aisle toward her, his eyes scanning the cabin as though he were looking for someone. He was tall, with dark hair and a sharp jawline, but there was something about him that made Sarah uneasy. He didn't look like a regular passenger. His demeanor was too confident, too controlled. He stopped just a few rows ahead of her, glancing quickly at his watch before speaking into a small earpiece. "I've located her," he said quietly. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Who was he? What did he want? And more importantly, why had he just said those words, "I've located her"? The mystery deepened with each passing moment, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the crew had been involved in something much bigger than she could have ever imagined. Something that was about to change her life forever. The man in the suit didn't approach her immediately, but Sarah could feel his presence like a heavy weight in the air. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Who was he? Why had he said, "I've located her"? And why did it feel like the entire cabin had shifted around her, like some invisible force had turned its focus onto her? Her heart pounded in her chest as the man slowly made his way toward the back of the plane, his eyes scanning the rows with the precision of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Sarah couldn't tear her gaze away from him. Every time he passed by a row, his eyes would flicker for a moment, landing on someone briefly, as if assessing whether they were the person he was looking for. But when he reached her row, his gaze lingered. For a heartbeat, he seemed to freeze, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a quiet nod, he walked past her and disappeared into the cockpit area. Sarah couldn't breathe. Something about that moment felt wrong, too deliberate. She was just a regular passenger, right? So why had he seemed so certain that he had found someone important? A wave of nausea hit her, and she forced herself to stand up. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the armrest, then made her way down the aisle to the restroom, needing a moment to collect her thoughts. As she passed by, she couldn't help but notice Emma and Mark watching her from the galley, their eyes unreadable. She was caught in a strange limbo. Had they recognized her, or were they in on something she didn't understand? Inside the restroom, Sarah locked the door behind her and leaned against the sink, staring at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable. There was no way anyone could know who she was just by looking at her. But deep down, a cold, gnawing feeling told her that wasn't true. Maybe they hadn't recognized her as Daniel Crawford's wife yet, but what if they were looking for her specifically for another reason? The thought rattled her, and she found herself glancing back at the door as if the answer to her questions might be lurking just beyond it. She knew she had to get back to her seat, but the unease inside her wouldn't let her. She felt exposed, vulnerable in a way she never had before. When she finally emerged from the restroom, her stomach churned as she noticed that the man in the suit had returned to his seat, right in the row across from hers. He was staring out the window, his body relaxed, but his posture was too stiff, too watchful. He wasn't just another passenger. He was waiting for something. Sarah's mind raced again. Was he part of the airline's staff? Or was he connected to something bigger, something beyond her understanding? A shiver ran down her spine as she thought about the way he had been watching her. The way he had said, "I've located her," as though he knew exactly who she was, even though she hadn't revealed herself to anyone. At that moment, a voice broke through her thoughts. It was Mark, the senior flight attendant, appearing beside her once more. "Ma'am, can I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, his tone smooth but insistent. Sarah stiffened. "I've already told you I'm fine," she replied, keeping her voice steady despite the chaos in her head. Mark didn't back down. "It's about your seating arrangement." Sarah swallowed hard. "There's nothing wrong with my seat. I'm fine here." Mark's lips twitched slightly, though he quickly hid it behind his professional facade. "It's not about the seat, ma'am. It's about the safety of all passengers." Her heartbeat quickened. Something about his words felt like a warning. "What do you mean by that?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Mark hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder, making sure no one was eavesdropping. He leaned in a little closer. "I'm afraid you're in the wrong seat. I'll need you to come with me. There's been a mistake." Sarah's pulse spiked. "What mistake? I'm just a passenger. I booked this flight normally." Mark's eyes flickered toward the man in the suit across the aisle, then quickly back to Sarah. "It's not about the flight, ma'am. It's about who you are." Her blood ran cold. He knew. He knew who she was. But how? Before she could react, Emma appeared at her side. "We need to move you, ma'am," she said, her voice more forceful now, and this time Sarah could hear a note of urgency underneath it. It was happening faster than Sarah could process. Her instincts screamed at her to run, to get away from these people who had suddenly surrounded her. But she had nowhere to go. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay calm. "I haven't done anything wrong. What's going on?" The tension in the air thickened. Emma's eyes flickered to Mark, and for a brief moment, they shared an unspoken exchange. Then Mark spoke again, his voice low and serious. "We can't discuss this here. Come with us now, and we'll explain everything." Sarah didn't move. Something in her gut told her not to trust them. "I'm not going anywhere until I understand what's happening." Emma's expression hardened. "Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it has to be." Before Sarah could respond, the man in the suit stood up again. He was moving with purpose, and his gaze was locked directly on her. As he walked toward her, his steps were measured and deliberate, like he had been waiting for this moment all along. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his presence that immediately felt different from the others. He wasn't part of the airline staff. He was someone else entirely, someone with a plan, and she had no idea what that plan was. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah said again, her voice gaining strength, though her hands shook slightly. The man in the suit studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You don't have a choice, Mrs. Crawford." At the mention of her name, Sarah froze. He knew her name. He knew exactly who she was. The mystery had deepened, and now, Sarah was caught in the web of something much bigger than her simple desire for a peaceful flight. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, what did they want from her? As she stood there, her mind racing, she couldn't help but feel the walls closing in. The flight attendants, the man in the suit, and the odd tension in the air. It was all connected. But how? And who was pulling the strings? She was about to find out, but not in the way she had hoped. The man in the suit's words hit Sarah like a bolt of lightning. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could only stare at him, unable to process what he had just said. Mrs. Crawford. How did he know her name? How did he know who she was? Her mind raced, scrambling for an explanation, but none came. She had gone through great lengths to keep her identity hidden from the public, to avoid the constant whispers and the prying eyes of the world. But here, in the confined space of this airplane, everything had shifted. Her desire for anonymity had become her worst enemy. The man stepped closer, his eyes fixed on her with a cold, calculating gaze. "It's in your best interest to come with me," he said, his tone calm but with an edge of authority that sent a shiver down her spine. For a heartbeat, Sarah felt like a trapped animal, cornered and unsure of which direction to run. Her mind screamed at her to refuse, to push back, but the weight of his presence and the strange sense of urgency in the air made her second-guess everything. Mark and Emma flanked her, their eyes unreadable. She had no idea who they truly were anymore. Were they just flight attendants doing their jobs, or were they part of whatever shadowy operation this man was a part of? She glanced around, hoping for someone, anyone, to intervene. But the other passengers were either oblivious or too terrified to get involved. Some pretended to look out the window. Others were glued to their phones, pretending not to notice the rising tension. It was as though the entire plane had become a stage, with her as the unwilling lead in some twisted drama. The man in the suit, sensing her hesitation, leaned in slightly. "You're not in any trouble, Mrs. Crawford," he said, his voice smooth but laced with an underlying warning. "You simply need to come with us. It's a matter of security." Security. The word hung in the air like a trap. Made no sense. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't even been in the spotlight recently. So why were they singling her out now? A rising panic began to claw at her chest. What if this was bigger than she could understand? What if her life, her simple life, was being pulled into something far more dangerous? "Why?" Sarah finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling. "Why me? What do you want from me?" The man's eyes softened for just a moment, though his voice remained firm. "We're not here to hurt you, Mrs. Crawford. But there are people who believe you're involved in something you're not. And it's our job to make sure you're safe." Safe. The words felt like a cruel joke. She was the one who needed protection. She was the one who felt like she was trapped in a web she hadn't even realized was spinning around her. "I don't believe you," she said, more to herself than to him. "This doesn't make sense." Emma stepped forward, her expression tense. "We're not asking you to trust us, ma'am. We're asking you to come with us quietly. It'll be easier that way." Easier. Sarah's stomach churned at the thought of walking into whatever trap they were setting. She had no idea who was behind this, but it didn't feel like a misunderstanding anymore. It felt like she was a pawn in someone's game. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin seemed to increase. The plane continued its flight, but it was as if the entire world outside had stopped. The sound of the engines, the hum of the air conditioning, it all faded into the background, leaving Sarah with nothing but the faces of Mark, Emma, and the man in the suit. Then, without warning, the man in the suit reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, sleek black device. It looked like a phone, but it had a cold, metallic sheen to it. He didn't speak as he held it up to his ear, his gaze never leaving Sarah's face. For a moment, she thought he was listening to someone on the other end, but then he suddenly spoke, his words clipped. "We need to move her now. It's getting too risky." The urgency in his voice sent another wave of cold dread through Sarah. Who was he talking to? And why was he so certain that things were escalating? Mark shifted slightly, his hands twitching at his sides as if he was ready to move at a moment's notice. Emma stepped closer to Sarah, her expression hardening. "Please, ma'am. We don't want to make this difficult." Difficult. Sarah felt like she was on the edge of a cliff, and they were all just waiting for her to fall. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They weren't just taking her for questioning. They were taking her somewhere, away from the plane, away from the life she knew. The man in the suit spoke again, his voice almost a growl. "We don't have time for this." Sarah's eyes darted toward the nearest exit, the emergency door. It was a stupid thought, but it was the only option that offered a sliver of hope. The flight attendants were watching her, though, closely, too closely. She couldn't escape through the front. The back was blocked. The entire cabin was closing in on her. The man in the suit saw the shift in her expression, and his lips curled into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. "You can't run, Mrs. Crawford. We have everything under control. You don't need to be afraid." But the words did nothing to calm her. If anything, they made her even more terrified. What kind of people were these? How had they gotten access to the flight to her so easily? A low, rumbling sound suddenly echoed through the plane. It wasn't the engines. It was something else. The passengers around her shifted uneasily in their seats. Some looked up, concern flickering in their eyes. Sarah could feel it too, something was off. She didn't know what it was, but she could feel the change in the air. Then, as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The tension remained, thick and suffocating. Sarah's breath came faster now. She couldn't keep up with the growing anxiety, the confusion, and the sense that everything around her was crumbling. She had never been a fighter. She had always avoided confrontation, always chosen the path of least resistance. But in that moment something snapped inside her. The weight of the situation, the pressure of the unknown, pushed her to the edge. She wasn't going to let them take her without a fight, not without understanding what was really happening. "I'm not going anywhere," Sarah whispered, her voice stronger than she felt. The man in the suit's eyes darkened. "Then we'll have to make you come with us." In that instant, Sarah realized she wasn't just being moved for questioning. This wasn't about security or some mistaken identity. This was something much darker. And if she didn't act soon, it might be too late to stop it. As the man in the suit moved closer, the pressure in the cabin seemed to mount with every passing second. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. She had never felt more cornered in her life. The man's cold smile remained fixed on his face, as though he were savoring the moment, enjoying the power he held over her. Just as Sarah's mind raced for a way to escape, a sudden, sharp noise interrupted the tension, a loud crackle from the intercom. The passengers around her tensed, their heads jerking up in unison, but the voice that came through the speakers was nothing like the calm, soothing announcements they were used to hearing. "This is Captain Johnson speaking," the voice blared, urgent and shaky. "We've encountered an issue. All passengers are to remain seated and calm. No one is to leave their seats until further notice. We repeat, stay calm and remain seated." Sarah's stomach dropped. The voice didn't sound like an announcement meant to reassure. There was panic there, a level of unease that made her feel like the ground had been pulled out from under her. What was happening? The man in the suit, who had been inching closer, stopped dead in his tracks. His expression faltered for the first time, a flash of confusion crossing his face before quickly being replaced by a tense, controlled expression. His eyes darted toward the front of the plane, then back to Sarah. "Stay seated," he muttered under his breath, his voice clipped. "Now!" Before Sarah could ask what was going on, she felt a sudden shift in the atmosphere, an eerie, unnatural stillness. The passengers, who had been tense moments ago, now looked terrified. Some had begun to whisper nervously among themselves, while others simply stared ahead, their faces pale. The hum of the plane seemed to dull, and the silence that followed felt heavy, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. "Is everything okay?" one of the passengers asked, her voice barely a whisper. But there was no answer. Only a strange, uneasy quiet that hung thick in the air. Sarah's mind was reeling. She had been so focused on the man in the suit and his cryptic warnings that she hadn't noticed the growing tension in the cabin. Now, as she glanced around, she saw it. The crew was moving more hurriedly than before, exchanging anxious glances with each other, some of them speaking in hushed tones. The unease was palpable. Then, as if to confirm her growing sense of dread, the man in the suit stepped away, his eyes scanning the cabin rapidly. He didn't speak to anyone else. He just stood there, his posture rigid, watching for something. At that exact moment, Sarah felt the plane dip slightly, a sudden jolt that threw her forward in her seat. Gasps filled the air. Some passengers grabbed onto the armrests, while others muttered prayers. The noise from the engines seemed to grow louder, But it wasn't the usual steady roar. This sounded strained, as though something was wrong with the plane itself. Before anyone could react, the man in the suit snapped his head toward the front of the cabin. His eyes narrowed. "What's happening?" he demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. What did he mean? What's happening? The crew members who had been flanking her suddenly moved toward the cockpit area, leaving Sarah isolated in her seat. The flight attendants, who had been so controlled moments ago, now appeared visibly shaken. Emma's hands trembled as she spoke into a walkie-talkie, her voice cracking slightly. "We need confirmation. Now." Her words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. Confirmation of what? What was happening on this flight? Then, before she could process it, another sharp dip shook the plane. This time, it was much more pronounced, and a terrified scream erupted from the back of the cabin. Passengers scrambled in their seats, their fear growing with every second. The man in the suit was no longer composed. His hand was clenched into a fist at his side. His eyes locked onto Sarah, as though she held the answers to all the questions that were tearing through his mind. The plane stabilized for a moment, and the intercom crackled once more. "This is Captain Johnson again. We've encountered a mechanical failure. We are currently attempting to regain control of the aircraft. Please remain calm." A mechanical failure. That didn't make sense. Why was the captain speaking like this? Why was the crew acting so strangely? The voice from the intercom sounded far too controlled for someone in the midst of a genuine emergency. Sarah's thoughts were interrupted as the man in the suit suddenly turned and began walking toward the cockpit, his movements fast and purposeful. He looked back over his shoulder for a brief moment, his gaze piercing. "Stay in your seat, Mrs. Crawford," he said, but his tone was no longer the cold authority it had been before. There was something almost desperate in it now, like he was on the edge of something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. Something was terribly wrong. The air in the cabin had shifted from tension to outright fear. The passengers, who had been anxiously eyeing the crew and each other, now seemed to be bracing themselves for something much bigger. Sarah could feel the weight of their fear, the shared unease that hung over everyone. She watched the man in the suit move swiftly down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain that separated the cabin from the cockpit. The flight attendants, Emma and Mark, were following him, but there was no sense of order now. They were all moving in a state of panic, as if they were on edge, waiting for something they couldn't control. In the tense silence that followed, Sarah's gaze shifted to the other passengers. They were all staring straight ahead now, some gripping their armrests, others with hands clenched in their laps. Everyone was waiting, as if they knew something was about to happen but had no idea what it would be. Her mind raced with possibilities. What could possibly cause a plane to shake like this? What had the captain been trying to say? And why was he so calm when everything around him seemed to be spiraling? She wasn't sure how much longer she could sit there and pretend that everything was fine. She felt like a fly caught in an intricate web of danger, and the more she resisted, the tighter it became. She had to know the truth, the whole truth. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that the answers might not be what she wanted to hear. Her hand trembled as she reached for her seatbelt, undoing the clasp, her mind swirling with questions. There was no turning back now. The plane was heading into unknown territory, and Sarah was at the center of something far more dangerous than a simple flight. As she stood up, determined to find out what was really happening, the intercom crackled once again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the captain's voice. It wasn't even the flight attendant's. It was a voice Sarah didn't recognize, low, distorted, and full of malice. "We've been waiting for you, Mrs. Crawford. And we're not going to let you get away." The voice on the intercom sent a chill down Sarah's spine. It was cold, distorted, and laced with a sinister undertone that made her heart race. "We've been waiting for you, Mrs. Crawford. And we're not going to let you get away." She froze, the words reverberating in her ears. The tension in the cabin was so thick she could almost taste it. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The passengers were still, their fear palpable, but none of them spoke, all of them waiting for something they couldn't see. Sarah's mind raced. Who was this? And why were they targeting her? The man in the suit, now at the front of the plane, was no longer the calm, collected figure he had been. His posture was stiff, his eyes darting back and forth. The fear in his eyes wasn't something she had expected to see. For the first time, Sarah realized he, too, was a pawn, just like her. Whatever this was, it was far bigger than he had let on. Her body tensed, her hand gripping the armrest as she stood frozen in place. She couldn't sit idly by any more. She needed to know the truth. Sarah had been caught in this web long enough. The plane suddenly jolted again, the engines rattling as if something was forcing it off course. The passengers gasped, and Sarah heard the murmurs of panic rise in the cabin. The man in the suit's eyes flickered nervously toward the cockpit, but he didn't move. Something was happening, something no one was prepared for. "Stay calm, everyone," one of the flight attendants called out, but her voice cracked, betraying her own fear. Sarah, her pulse pounding in her ears, took a step forward. The crew was in disarray, but there was still no sign of any authority from the cockpit. Her instincts kicked in. This was her moment. She had to take action. "Where are they taking me?" Sarah's voice trembled but was laced with a quiet defiance as she asked the question that had been plaguing her. The man in the suit hesitated for a moment before answering, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't quite place. "We don't have time for this," he said, his voice low and tense. "I'll explain everything once we land." But the way he said it only raised more questions. Land. Was the plane really in that much danger? Or was there something else going on, something far more sinister? A sudden sharp crackle came through the intercom again, the same voice as before, the voice that had sent a shiver down her spine. "You're already too late," it said, each word dripping with malice. "She's ours now. And there's no going back." The words struck Sarah like a slap to the face. Her mind raced. Was this about her? Or was it about someone else? The voice had sounded like it was addressing someone specific. But before she could process the implications of that, everything around her seemed to explode into chaos. The plane dipped sharply, throwing everyone off balance. Screams erupted from the passengers as the flight attendants rushed to their stations. The man in the suit was gone, disappearing into the cockpit area, leaving Sarah standing there, caught in the middle of something she couldn't comprehend. "Ma'am, please sit down," Emma shouted at Sarah, her voice full of panic. But there was no time to listen to her. Sarah's eyes darted to the front of the plane, where the cockpit door was now wide open. The flight attendants were frantically speaking to someone inside, their voices urgent and panicked. She caught glimpses of shadowy figures in the cockpit, but she couldn't make out the details. Whatever was happening, it wasn't just a simple mechanical failure. "Get away from the door!" someone shouted from the back of the plane, but the warning came too late. The door to the cockpit slammed shut with a loud metallic bang, and in the sudden silence, Sarah's heart sank. She wasn't just trapped in this plane, she was trapped in a nightmare. And then, with a terrifying lurch, the plane began to descend rapidly. There was no mistaking it now. Whatever had been orchestrating this disaster was ready to make their move. Sarah's stomach dropped as she realized just how high the stakes had become. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just some mistake made by a crew member. This was an intentional, calculated effort to get her into the crosshairs of something far bigger than she could have imagined. Her mind reeled with the possibilities, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had to do something. She had to take control. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, as though they were all waiting for her to make the next move. The intercom crackled one last time. "Brace yourselves, everyone," the distorted voice said. "This is the final descent." And then, just as Sarah was about to push forward and make her way toward the cockpit, something happened that froze her in place. The lights flickered. The air grew unnervingly cold. And for the briefest of moments, the world outside the window seemed to flicker as well, like a glitch in reality itself. It was only a brief moment, But in that fleeting instant, Sarah saw it, the truth. The whole story, the whole setup. The plane wasn't just malfunctioning, it was part of the plan. The strange figures in the cockpit, the weird behavior of the crew, the cryptic messages. It all made sense now. But the biggest revelation of all hit her like a ton of bricks. The person they had been after wasn't her at all. It was the man in the suit. The person they had been hunting was him, not her. The entire plane had been set up to lead her to this point, to push her into the center of a high-stakes game of survival. In that moment of clarity, Sarah realized that the man who had been trying to control everything had never been in control at all. He was just as trapped as the rest of them. With a final, deafening noise, the plane lurched again, and the world outside seemed to fall apart. The tension was too much, and Sarah's thoughts blurred into chaos. But one thing remained clear in her mind. Whatever was happening, whatever game they were playing, was far from over. And as the plane continued its plunge, Sarah realized that she was about to be part of something far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Something bigger than the flight, bigger than herself. The final descent was just the beginning. The plane's descent was agonizingly slow, almost as if it were being controlled by an unseen force, reluctant to fully give way to gravity. The passengers gripped their armrests, faces pale and bodies tense, bracing for an impact that seemed inevitable. The lights flickered again, then stayed dark, leaving the cabin in a cold, eerie gloom. The murmurs of panic grew louder, and the once structured chaos of the crew now seemed to have turned into complete disarray. Sarah felt a tightening in her chest, as if the very air itself had become dense, each breath more labored than the last. But amidst the terror and confusion, one thought kept repeating in her mind. This isn't just a mechanical failure. This is orchestrated. And the man in the suit, whoever he is the key. Her eyes searched the cabin, landing on the empty space where the man had been moments earlier. He was no longer in the aisle, nor had he returned to the cockpit. In fact, the cockpit was silent, completely still. No frantic movement from the crew. It felt almost as if time had stopped, as if everyone was waiting for the inevitable. Suddenly, the intercom crackled again, but this time it wasn't the distorted voice that had been sending shivers down Sarah's spine. It was the voice of Captain Johnson, although it too was strained and shaky. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are on a controlled descent. Please stay in your seats and prepare for an emergency landing. I repeat, remain calm." The calmness in the captain's voice did little to reassure the passengers. Sarah could sense the underlying fear in the way the words were delivered. She knew deep down that they weren't in safe hands, not by a long shot. She had seen the way the crew was behaving, the fear in their eyes. This wasn't an ordinary flight. There was something darker happening, something sinister. Sarah turned toward the front of the plane, trying to see if there was any sign of the man in the suit or any of the crew members she had come to trust. But the aisle was empty. And then, just as she was about to rise from her seat to investigate further, there was a sudden thud, a jarring sound from above. The overhead compartments began to shake, and the whole plane seemed to jerk violently. A loud, mechanical screech filled the air, as if the plane itself were protesting the rapid descent. The passengers screamed, some crying out for their loved ones, others clutching the arms of the seats beside them. Sarah instinctively grabbed onto her armrest as the plane bucked again. This time it felt as if they were plummeting. The rush of wind from outside blasted against the windows, drowning out the cries of panic in the cabin. Her stomach dropped. It was like the world was being turned upside down. But amidst the chaos, Sarah focused. She had to know what was going on. She had to find the man in the suit. Then, just as quickly as it had all started, the plane suddenly steadied. The noise from the engines quieted, the screeching stopped, and the air became eerily calm again. Sarah opened her eyes, not even realizing she had closed them in the first place. Her heart was still pounding in her chest, but it was quieter now, at least on the outside. She glanced around. The panic had subsided for the moment, though fear was still etched on every face. People looked confused, as if the very nature of reality had been shattered for them. Everyone except Sarah seemed to be waiting for the next horrifying event. But something was different now. The plane wasn't descending at breakneck speed anymore. It had leveled out, hovering in the air as if they were waiting for something. Just then the door to the cockpit creaked open. Sarah's eyes locked onto it immediately. Out of the shadows, the man in the suit appeared. He stepped slowly into the cabin, his movements purposeful, though there was a noticeable weariness in the way he carried himself. His once confident demeanor had crumbled. Now there was something haunted in his eyes. He was no longer the powerful figure Sarah had feared. He was just a man caught in a situation far beyond his control. "You don't understand," the man said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. He glanced around at the passengers, his face filled with guilt. "None of this was supposed to happen. None of you were supposed to be involved." Sarah stood frozen, still unsure what to believe. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice shaking. He exhaled sharply, his shoulders slumping. "This was supposed to be a simple flight, a way to get you away from the people looking for you. But they're watching. They've been watching us the whole time." "Who are you talking about?" Sarah pressed, her pulse quickening. He looked around at the crew members who had gathered near the cockpit. Some were silently watching him, others with their heads down as if ashamed. It was clear they knew more than they were willing to admit. "The people who wanted you. The ones who planned this," he muttered. "They've been pulling the strings from the very beginning." Everything clicked into place in Sarah's mind. The strange behavior of the crew. The sudden announcement that there was a mechanical failure. The cryptic messages over the intercom. And the man in the suit's presence. He had been part of it all. But now he was just as trapped as she was. Before Sarah could react, the intercom crackled again, and this time the distorted voice returned. "You think you can escape, Mrs. Crawford?" Sarah's blood ran cold. It was the same voice. The same menacing tone. "You're in our hands now," the voice continued. "The flight will not end until we say it does. You and the others will never be allowed to leave." But as the voice spoke, something unexpected happened. The cabin doors, which had been sealed shut, suddenly popped open. The emergency exit lights began to flash. The crew, their eyes wide with fear, scrambled for control. And that's when Sarah realized they were free. The voice had revealed itself too soon. The plan was falling apart. The figure who had been orchestrating it all, hidden in the shadows, had underestimated one thing: the power of the human spirit. The courage to fight back, even in the face of the unknown. With the doors open, the captain, along with the remaining crew, managed to regain control of the plane. The emergency landing was bumpy, but it was enough to bring them safely to the ground. The police were waiting as soon as the plane touched down, and the authorities quickly moved in to secure the situation. Sarah stepped off the plane, her feet on solid ground once again. The weight that had pressed on her chest for what felt like an eternity was finally lifted. But as she looked back at the plane, at the wreckage of the journey she had just endured, she realized something. It wasn't over. There were still questions unanswered, and the shadow of the people behind this conspiracy still loomed over her. But for now she was free, and that, she realized, was the most important thing.